而 Mr. Schleicher 嘅演講題目係教育為未來國際比較的啟示。The keynote topic is educating students for their future, not our past. Insights from international comparisons. Mr. Schleicher, please.
Thank you. Secretary Lam and Chief Executive Lam and also Secretary Yang. It's a great privilege for me to be in Hong Kong again. I've always been a great admirer of the education system in Hong Kong, particularly the school system. Hong Kong consistently performs among the top systems in the world. But perhaps more importantly, Hong Kong has been able to reconcile a fairly market-based approach to schooling and education with a high degree of equity and educational opportunity. I think that's what makes Hong Kong really stand out. But we need to look forward. The world is changing fast. And to educate children for their own future rather than what we have become so familiar as our past. If you think about, a decade ago, technology used to be somewhere in a computer or in a smartphone. Then the virtual reality and the real reality became sort of integrated. And suddenly we've been all connected. But at the very same time, the world has also become more volatile, more complex, more ambiguous. In fact, in the past, literacy was something simple to teach. You just teach people how to process information, to extract information from a book. And when you didn't know the answer to a question, you could ask your teacher. Teacher could direct you to an encyclopedia. You could look up the answer, and you could trust the answer to be true. Today, you look up information on Google or on Weibo, and you get 100,000 answers to your question. Nobody tells you what's right, what's wrong, what's true, what's not true. Literacy has become about constructing knowledge, validating knowledge, taking a critical stance. Much harder to teach, much harder to learn. Also, while it's great that we are all connected, technology tends to sort us into kind of echo chambers. We're much more likely to learn with people, be with people who think like us, who are like us, while the diversity in our communities and our societies is much harder to engage with for young people. That's the challenge that we have for the future. Here's some data on this. We ask young people, 15-year-olds, to what extent, how they relate to the internet. You can see actually in virtually every country, it's the majority of 15-year-olds who say, I feel really bad if I'm not connected. Being connected to the net has become like, breathing air or drinking water for people. In some countries, it's 8 out of 10 students. And if you look at how this has changed over the last 3 years alone, in some countries, the time that students spend on the internet outside a school day has doubled in just 3 years. Hong Kong has only slightly increased. You keep your children very busy with other things. That's a great thing. But you can see really the digital reality, the virtual reality, has become the real world for many people. And if you now sort of think ahead what this means for our future, digitalization is incredibly democratizing. Everybody can participate, everybody can collaborate. But it's also concentrated power at a rate that we have never seen before. Digitalization is incredibly particularizing. The smallest voice can be heard anywhere. You can post something on Twitter and everybody can know about it. But it's also incredibly homogenizing, squashing individuality, cultural uniqueness. Everything becomes sort of a mesh. Digitalization is incredibly empowering, and Hong Kong is such a fantastic example on this. If you want to do something big these days, you no longer need a lot of money, a lot of technical resources. All you need is a big idea. In fact, if you look at the world's largest companies that were created over the last decade, they were all created with an idea. They had the product before they had the money. That's the digital world. But digitalization can also be incredibly disempowering. Often we become the slaves of algorithms and technology. Where you end up on this chart has a lot to do with your education, and therefore with teaching. The point I also want to make is that the kind of things that are easy to teach, easy to test, are precisely the kind of things that are also easy to digitize. Routine cognitive knowledge, memorization, hoping that what we learn is going to help us later in life. That works less and less. Where we are seeing a rise in the demand for skills is the capacity of people to not reproduce what they learned, but to extrapolate from what they know and use and apply their knowledge creatively in a new context. That's where the premium is. And the last category, the green line, is important. Social skills. Our capacity to collaborate, to compete, to connect with people who are different from us. That's where you can see economies extracting more and more value out of the people. Some things decline, some things grow in their importance. And we need to recognize in the way we teach and in which we learn. Some people have described this as a race between technology and education. Before the industrialization, basically, neither education nor technology mattered for the vast majority of people. Then came the industrialization, moving technology ahead of people. And while today we marvel at all the outcomes of the Industrial Revolution, you wouldn't have wanted to live in those times. Most people were left out. They didn't have the skills to actually, thrive on that. But then, we invented public schooling, and you can see how education moved ahead of technology and created generations of prosperity. But if we're honest, since then we haven't seen very much change in the model of schooling. We still use a quite heavy industrial approach to learning, educating students in batches, all at the same time, all learning the same curriculum, all doing the same examination. It's a kind of industrial approach. And today we have the digital revolution, moving technology once again ahead of the people. And we are seeing already signs of, again, the kind of social pain. We have university graduates having difficulty finding a job, and at the same time, employers telling us they cannot find the people with the skills they need. This growing gap between what our societies demand and what we can produce. The question is really, how do we move up again? Education ahead of the technology of our times. Let me have a look at recent trends with you. At the OECD, through our PISA comparisons, we always look at the knowledge and skills of students, compare them internationally. And one thing that makes PISA special is that we do not put much of a premium on the reproduction of subject matter content. Most of the content that we test, actually, we give the students because they could have looked it up on the web. What we want to know is whether, for example, in a field like science, students can think like a scientist. Can they design an experiment? Do they know what questions are scientifically investigable? That's the kind of test. And we started that series in 2006. 2006 is a very long time ago for many of us. In fact, one way to remember it, it was a year before the iPhone was invented. We didn't have smartphones in those days. Very, very hard to imagine. Twitter was still a sound by that time. The Amazon, still a river. Many of the technologies that we take for granted today did not exist in those times. But when you look across the industrialized world, students have learned more things, but they have not improved their skills to think like a scientist. Deep conceptual understanding, epistemic understanding. And the world didn't stop in 2009. Maps became dynamic, cars became electric, now they can drive without a driver, lots of changes. But again, we haven't seen that translate in improvements in the capacities of young people. And just think of the last 3 years. You can think about, robotics, cloud computing, big data, bioengineering, huge changes in the world of science and technology. But actually, the capacity of young people to use scientific knowledge, to think like a scientist, is actually declining. Despite rising investments in education, we've seen a decline. There are some good counter-examples. You can see some countries in Europe, Portugal in this example, moving consistently up, or Singapore, moving from good to great on this. But actually, they are the exception. They're not the rule. Those rapid improvers. When you put Hong Kong into this, high performance, but actually slight decline in science. You changed your curriculum, you made science sort of fewer students taking part in science courses, and you can see the result of that. But I should say there have been improvements in mathematics. Now, that sort of Hong Kong is a system that is still one of the top performing systems in the world. But you can see, you change the instructional system, you can see that in changes in results. So overall, around the world, a changing world, but education is not keeping up with the demands of our societies. This is a chart that is also very important. Here I show you on the vertical axis the quality of the education system. Hong Kong doing really, really well. And on the horizontal axis, equity and the distribution of educational opportunities. And that's where the results for Hong Kong are truly remarkable. You're a quite diverse country, a diverse kind of society, large kind of disparities in income, and so on. But the education system has been able to actually give every child an excellent education. That's a great strength. But also that is under threat in the years to come. The pressure on education systems to keep equity is something I think we need to look forward. I want to look at this in another way. We didn't only test the students' capacities, looking at what they can do, what they know. We also wanted to know, what's your aspiration for your own future? And this is the share of students who say basically, I want to become a scientist. They're not only learning science, but they also see this as their own future. And this is sort of something I want to draw your attention to. Some education systems that do really, really well in terms of science, knowledge, and skills. You can look at Korea, China, 4 provinces of China for which you have data, Japan, or Finland. They do really, really well in the knowledge and skills of students. But students don't want to have anything to do with science in their real lives. So school has not really succeeded. School has been a dry subject where students do hard, they do well, but it has not translated into the kind of personal aspiration. Hong Kong is doing a lot better on that. In Hong Kong, you have excellent results and a fair high chance of actually having students aspiring to science. But look at the United States. Students don't do well in science. They don't know a lot about science. They don't have good test results. But every American wants to become a scientist. So now you look at this chart and you tell yourself, yeah, well, maybe we have to make a choice. Either we educate our children well, or actually they have some dreams to become scientists. But actually, you can reconcile this now. In the red circle, I'm going to put those countries that are doing well in science. In the purple one, I show you those countries where students believe in science as a method of social inquiry. It's also very important. Do we trust the methods of science to be useful for society? And in blue, the countries that actually have students that also want to become scientists. And the question, of course, is, can you combine all of that? Can you get into the middle of the cycle? And actually you can. You look at Singapore, you look at Canada, and then at some lower levels of performance, a range of other countries. It is possible to reconcile excellence and aspirations. And then there are countries, in the sort of circle where you can see students do well, they believe in science, and the system in Hong Kong is also part of that. There are systems where education has succeeded really well in delivering knowledge and skills, but students do not, see this as something that is opening life opportunities for them. And of course, you have the systems like the United States, where students want to become scientists, they believe in science, but they're not prepared for it. So you can be everywhere on this chart. But the point I want to make is actually education systems can reconcile the social and emotional attachment of students to science and excellence in outcomes. We also know something that relates those two. If students do not enjoy learning science, you can see that the link between doing well in science and actually learning outcomes is fairly weak. If students do enjoy learning science, you can see that link become strong. In other words, if you teach students science and they don't like it, they can learn it well, but they're not going to translate it into their own aspirations. If you succeed to make your students enjoy what they learn, you achieve both. You translate high levels of performance into actually strong personal aspirations. That's where teaching really comes into this. The last point I want to make, and I think this is the greatest challenge for the education system in Hong Kong, is that many 15-year-olds actually do not, say that they have high, aspirations or expectations in terms of life satisfaction. And that's true for some other countries in Asia as well. Korea is in the same corner, the 4 provinces of China for which we have data. It's a big challenge for those education systems. Again, does it mean that if you do well in education, students will not enjoy their lives? Not necessarily. There are other education systems that do well, the Netherlands, Finland, Switzerland, Estonia. These are also high-performing systems, quite similar to Hong Kong in terms of the quality of the outcomes. But students at the same time are also very happy with their lives. So we studied this. Factors that contribute to life satisfaction have a lot to do with perceived teacher support. I'm going to come back to this later on because I think it's very important for your agenda, where students feel that their teachers are genuinely interested in them as people, as persons, apart from the academic success. Students tend to be happier with their lives. Parental support, very important as well. And socializing with friends, more physical activity, all of those factors contribute positive to life satisfaction. What makes people less satisfied with their lives? Anxiety with schoolwork, high internet use. Those things are actually what against students being happy with their lives. That's an important frontier today because, again, those social and emotional aspects are increasingly important for success in the world in which we live today. Again, on this chart, you can see that this is not a choice. You can actually accomplish strong learning outcomes and high levels of life satisfaction. They should not be seen as opposing policy objectives or opposing objectives for teachers. So, we have this dramatically expanding world of knowledge. And that's the kind of challenge that confronts schools. Every day the world becomes more complex, more rich in everything. And it's filled with so many ideas, with so many different facets. And all of them are associated with people. That's one of the very important parts that we need to understand today, that knowledge is never transmitted in isolation. Knowledge is always transmitted through people, mediated through people, in the real world and in school. Technology can amplify great teaching, but technology can never replace the process, the social and relational process of teaching. And compared to that, the little world of schooling is just so tiny. The world is so rich, the world of schooling is so tiny, and actually what we want is, put everything in the world into this little box. Now, that's the temptation that we fall into every day. And what happens when we do that? Often the rich features of society, of the world, are translated into very shallow shadows of themselves in the school system. I give you an example. Every primary student in Hong Kong loves science. Science is about, experimenting, seeing how the world works. It's about, engaging with doing something, understanding the world. If you ask students at the age of 15, you've seen that before. Many students hate science. What has happened in those years? Well, this experimenting, this trying out has become, a world of formulas and equations, very abstract, very hard to relate to. And that's true in many parts of the world, but our response has been, to put more and more and more things into this little box. And the hard thing today is, going back to the principles that really make us different from technology. In the times of artificial intelligence, the question is, how will we pair the artificial intelligence of computers with the human qualities that enable us to empower humans? If we, think about humans subsidiating computers, make students almost as smart as a smartphone, we're not going to be very successful. It has to do with the realm of human knowledge, the realm of ethics and judgment, the realm of, political and civic life, the realm of creativity, aesthetics, design, and so on. Those are the real features that are very, very important. Now, how do we get there? Money is always important. In fact, the chief executive has highlighted, the investment Hong Kong is making in education. But as you can see from the chart, money makes a huge difference for low-performing kind of systems, not investing very much. But sort of Hong Kong is already at the point where, more money is always good, but it's much more a question of how do we utilize resources? How do we make trade-offs and choices in education? That is a huge challenge. Money is necessary, but not sufficient for actually success in education. Time. Everybody will tell you, you add 1 more hour of mathematics and you're going to get better math outcomes. You add 1 more hour of history, you get better history outcomes. Every teacher, every school is going to tell you that. And there is some truth in that. There is a positive relationship between the time we spend learning in a school and the learning outcomes, according to our data. But when you look at this across countries, the picture looks very different. Look at this. The more time students spend learning, the worse they come out on PISA. Think about this. Within a country, time is very important. Across countries, time works against you. How can you reconcile this? Actually, the answer is not that difficult. The quality of learning outcomes is always the product of the time that we spend and how we use that time. I want to show you this in another chart. In blue, you see the time that students spend learning in school. In yellow, you see the time that students spend learning outside of school, private tutoring, homework, all those kind of things. And you can see that varies hugely across countries. You can look at the United Arab Emirates, where students learn 60 hours per week. And you can look at Finland, where this is just about a little more than half that time. Huge differences in the time students spend learning. But when you look at productivity in the education system, learning gains per hour of instruction, you can see in countries like Finland or Germany or Switzerland, Japan, Estonia, and so on, students learn a lot in very little time. And in the United Arab Emirates, students spend a lot of time, but learn very little. That is really, and you can see sort of Hong Kong is somewhere in the middle, also to the positive side, but that's sort of the key question. It's not about adding more time to students' busy calendars. It's about using that time most productively. The scarcest resource in education is not money. The chief executive can always put more money into the education system. The scarcest resource that we have in education is how we use the kind of student learning time. Huge differences across countries. So how do we get there? Well, the challenge is to move from a system where only some people succeed to a system where all students succeed. This is the most important challenge, perhaps, for our societies these days. In the past, our economies were very generous to people with low skills. There was a lot of space for people with low skills to still earn a decent salary. That space is disappearing very, very rapidly. And it's not, things like moving people and so on around. It's very much to do with technology. The challenge is also to move from a world where we focus on routine cognitive skills that are disappearing to basically complex ways of thinking, complex ways of working, collective capacity in the system. And that has huge implications for teacher quality. In the past, you can teach all students in the same way. Today, teachers really need to work as professional knowledge workers. And that's actually, I think, something where is a great strength in the case of Hong Kong, where the system is really owned by schools, where teachers do have a lot of discretion for actually using their knowledge. And that has implications for the work organization, shifting from the kind of industrial work organization education to a truly professional work organization. So those are the kind of transitions that we need to think about in the world in which we live today. Let's have a look at some of the data on this. How do we move from having only some students to succeed to getting every student to do well? Here's some data on that. Basically, I start with a country, the Dominican Republic. I'm going to order their performance by decile of social background. In the red square, you see the poorest kids, how they do in school. In the green triangle, the wealthiest families, how their children do at school. And you can see basically in the Dominican Republic, there's a huge performance gap depending on the social background of children. So some people say, well, poverty is destiny. We knew that. But then you see how this works out differently across countries. And you can see, the country where you go to school makes so much more of a difference for your learning outcomes than the social background that you come from. The 10% most disadvantaged students in Hong Kong do as well as the average student in the United States, and they do better than the 10% wealthiest children in much of Latin America or other parts of the world. This is the truly impressive outcome that Hong Kong has achieved, ensuring that poor students get an excellent education. And we actually know some factors that are behind it. This basically is, how capable is our system to attract the most talented teachers to the most challenging classrooms, how to get the best resources into the most difficult schools. And you want to be in the green part of the chart, where actually you align resources with needs. But you can see most countries are deep in the red. In most countries, actually, education systems, if you come from a poor family, we're going to give you the less qualified teacher and the poorer resources and so on. And Hong Kong is at least moving into the green part. Hong Kong's system has been highly capable in aligning resources with needs. You should pride yourself on this because it's one of the most difficult things to achieve. And you can see in much of the world, actually, this is a long way to go. Variability in school performance. I know you're very kind of focused on school performance, which are the better performing school or the lower performing schools. But actually, if you look at this in the light of this data, the variation between schools that are marked here in blue is actually quite limited in Hong Kong. Most schools perform really, really well. Variability in school performance is the smaller part of the issue. The bigger issue is variability within the school. That's the yellow part. In other words, it's not just about, I choose the right school for my child and everything is sorted out. No, there's a lot to do with, the teacher, the kind of arrangements, the subjects I choose. All of those things matter a lot. And that's much harder to deal with for public policy and for teachers. A lot of diversity in the student population within schools. That's where the primary challenge really lies, and it's true for other countries as well. But I think that's a very important point for you. Now, some people have said, well, if we give schools a lot of autonomy, that will, amplify disparities and, diversity in the school performance. In fact, our data show the opposite, and Hong Kong actually has contributed to that. You can actually see the more autonomy schools have, the greater their capacity to align resources with needs. Which tells you actually that schools are very, very good in the capacity to understand their needs and aligning resources with needs. Much better than education systems that tend to be very centrally driven and sort of do these things top down. Very, very important finding. So this is where your system plays to the strengths of ensuring equity. What are the kind of policy levers that we see associated with this? You can see basically managing the school network. I think that's a very, very important task. And one thing where probably parents help you a lot. I know that there's a lot of concern and parents are very kind of intrusive in the education systems in Hong Kong, but probably it's keeping the system together. It's keeping sort of an external demand on this kind of school system. Your approach to school financing is also a great strength of the system. There are other ways of doing this as well. Admission policies, this is the most contentious part. How do you actually regulate admission? I think there is, room for debate in Hong Kong on this. How do you actually align schools? How do you link the highest performing with lower performing schools? This is one thing that Shanghai in China does really, really well. They're very good in sort of mobilizing the expertise of high performing schools to help low performing schools succeed and improve. Sometimes higher performing schools are going to get more money, but they cannot use that money in their own school. They can use that money only to improve other schools. So building those kinds of mechanisms can be very powerful to moderate between school variability. And of course, engaging society is always important. Schools also can become very important resources for their community. We should see sort of the interaction between communities and schools as something really, really important. First of all, often schools now offer extracurricular activities, so students can do other things in school and other players from community, but also schools can draw on the resources of communities. For example, how do you actually ensure that students have an aspiration for their future? How do they understand the value of sciences? Not necessarily just by having their teachers talk about them, but maybe having scientists and parents talking about their experiences in science. That's about, drawing on the resources of schools and building that kind of link between communities and schools is something that we see as very, very important for improving school performance. And also, parents' interest. You can see, for example, where students believe their parents are really interested in their success at school, you can see they are have greater aspirations themselves, and they are happier with their lives. We can see a strong link between parental engagement with students and actually students' satisfactions with their own lives across countries. Where parents don't feel that, or students don't feel their parents really involved, you can see students are more likely to feel lonely at school or actually not being satisfied with their lives. Making parents part of the equation of the social and school life is very important. Here's some more detailed data on this. You can really see, where parents say they discuss how well my child is doing at school, they have the meal together with a student, they spend time just talking with their child, not necessarily about schoolwork. You can see life satisfaction is significantly higher. I'm showing you this because that's one of the challenges that our data show for Hong Kong. They're good at school, but not satisfied with their lives. The parental interaction is really important. And you can also see school activities. Integration in school is a good predictor for students' life expectations. And, also PISA scores are linked to this. So this is not just about, sense of belonging or, satisfaction with life. It's also positive related to performance in school. Why do I say this? You can say, well, this is a problem of parents, not the problem of schools. No, it's not. It's actually very much an issue of how open schools are to the resources of the community to strengthen that link between parents and school. That's, I think, one of the challenges in many education systems. How do we move from a system that is telling people what good teaching is and how things work to actually have a system that is owned by the profession? How do we move from a system that is, focused on administrative control and accountability on true professional forms of work organization? Let me show you a couple of points here. First of all, the question always is, what do we actually mean by teacher professionalism? Well, let me tell you what I mean. First of all, it has a lot to do with public confidence in the profession. It's rare to have genuine professionalism in a school without the public having trust in that level of professionalism. It has to do with professional preparation and learning. It has to do with collective ownership of professional practice. Professional autonomy is not about, I do what I like to do in my class. Professional autonomy is, I know what is right to do in the name of my profession today in the class. Collective ownership. Teachers seeing themselves as, producers of professional wisdom rather than just as consumers of this. And actually, many education systems now give their teachers a lot of time for those kinds of activities. If you're a teacher in Shanghai, you teach between 11 and 16 hours per week, a lot less than in Hong Kong. But you actually work at least the same amount of hours in total. The answer is there's more time devoted to working individually with students, to working with parents, to working with other teachers, to observe other teachers' lessons and so on. And that is a very, very important feature to build, to have sort of teachers frame collective practice. To make decisions in accordance with the body of professional knowledge and also to accept professional responsibility. Those things are what distinguish professions today. So how do we build them? Well, in our assessment, it has to do with three things. It has to do with the knowledge base for teaching. How well do you know your subject? How well do you know your students? How well do you know how your students learn? Cognitive science, brain research, all of those actually are very, very important resources for teachers to know to actually build the kind of knowledge base. It has to do with professional autonomy. Very, very important driver of success in all our data systems. The discretion that teachers have to be designers of innovative learning environments. And the third part is also very important. It's to do with a collaborative culture. What opportunities do teachers have to learn from each other, to work with each other, to do all of those kinds of things? Unfortunately, we don't have on this diagram data for Hong Kong still, but I hope they're going to come soon. But I want to show you something that is really, really important. Professionalism measured by those three dimensions. Again, professional knowledge, professional autonomy, professional collaboration. You can see is one of the biggest drivers of teacher job satisfaction. It's one of the biggest drivers of the status that teachers have in society. Imagine that. Where teachers show a higher degree of professionalism, they perceive their status in society to be higher. So there's a link between professionalism and the appreciation of societies for teachers. And also teacher self-efficacy. That's also very important. When teachers have a higher degree of professionalism, they see themselves much more empowered to make good decisions. In turn, you can see that we found no relationship between teacher job satisfaction and class size. No. Teacher job satisfaction depends on professionalism. No. We cannot see a link between job satisfaction and the size of the class. No. In fact, one of the things that we see consistently across countries is that high-performing education systems like Hong Kong consistently prioritize the quality of teaching and teachers over the size of classes. That's one of the biggest traps that many countries in the Western world have fallen in. They have made classes smaller and smaller, but because they were not able to generate more money, they have given teachers less and less time for other things than teaching. If you're a teacher in the United States, you teach almost double the hours of teaching than in Hong Kong. But the price for this is that teachers have just no time for anything else. That's the price, the cost of small classes. Very important to keep in mind that job satisfaction and efficacy have a lot to do with professionalism, time for other things than teaching, and not to do so much with the things that we usually associate with this. Let me show you some data on this. On the vertical axis, I show you the student-teacher ratio. The lower you are, the more generous you are to provide teachers to your system. No? On the horizontal axis, I show you the class size. And now you say, well, the two should be the same. If I have more teachers, I can make my classes smaller. That's true. But you can also see there is no relationship across those two dimensions. No? In fact, you compare the United States with the 4 provinces of China for which we have data, and you can see they more or less allocate the same share of teachers to students. But in the United States, classes are small. In China, classes are very large. And that is precisely because the resources are used differently. No? Hong Kong is sort of a little bit more like the United States, a little bit less like China. Hong Kong sort of devotes more resources to this. But again, you can see, you can use your teaching resources in different ways. And actually, what is very important to give teachers enough space for true professionalism. How do you move from, looking upwards in the education system to looking outwards? No? What opportunities do teachers have to learn from other teachers, to work with other teachers, to work with other schools, to actually engage in the profession? No? Very, very important part. And here I show you sort of two things. On the left side, you see sort of informal activities for teachers to share knowledge. No? And you can see teachers are generally very social people. They, do lots of things, share resources, do team conferences, lots of things to share their expertise and knowledge. But when it comes to the kind of deeper professional collaboration, teaching together, doing collaborative professional development, observing other teachers' classrooms, you can see they're actually quite rare. And it's the right side of the chart that has an impact on outcomes, not the left side. You can see that and you can see in some countries, the results are better, but in most countries, that is a big kind of challenge. Why do I say that? Because we know that the more teachers teach jointly, the more they observe other teachers' classes, the more they engage in joint activities, the more they take part in collaborative professional learning, the more they own their profession. So actually, the collaborative nature of the teaching profession is a very, very important driver of professionalism. And remember, professionalization is the best predictor you have for self-efficacy of teachers, for job satisfaction, and for the perceived status of the teaching profession. These things are really, really important, and they can be framed by public policy. The working conditions that we provide for teachers have a huge influence on the nature of the profession and the way we work together. How do we move, again, to ownership of professional practice? Let me show you something again. I don't have data for Hong Kong on this, but I want to show you sort of the gap that sometimes exists between what teachers believe and say and what they actually do. Take a country like England. Almost every teacher says, my role as a teacher is to facilitate students' own inquiry. Very constructivist view on teaching. Students learn best by finding solutions on their own. Or thinking and reasoning is more important than curriculum content. Very constructivist view on teaching, very well aligned with the notion of the 21st century. So you're saying, wow, these British teachers are really amazing. But the question is, do they do what they say? Actually, if they would, you find them at the bottom out of the chart. Here I show basically the emphasis on memorization. And if British teachers would have this kind of very constructivist approach to teaching, they would come very low on memorization because that's not really about those kind of teaching practices. But the bottom part is already occupied by Switzerland, then comes Poland, Germany, and so on. Actually, Britain comes out right on top. Very strong emphasis on traditional memorization skills. And actually, if I had asked you at the beginning, who comes out on top of memorization, many people would have tipped, on China or Hong Kong. But in fact, just sort of an average performer on that. In fact, a system like Shanghai in China is actually very, very strong on other things. Deep conceptual understanding. Those kinds of elaboration strategies that are very, very important for student success. Am I able to relate what I don't know with what I know? Can I think out of the box? Can I connect the dots where the next idea is going to come from? And actually, Britain is not so good on this. So in a way, there's a gap between what teachers say and what they do often. Closing that gap has to do with professionalism. It's not achieved, top-down by telling teachers what to do. It's very much to do with giving teachers the kind of mirror where they can see themselves and learn from each other, learn with each other. Very, very important on this. Let me show you some data on this. Some people say memorization is a great learning strategy. You can learn a lot of things by memorizing things. And of course, that's true. But look at this. In the green part, I'm going to show you the tasks where memorization will help you. And in red, I show you where memorization is actually hindering learning. And I make the red part bigger than the green part, so I give you a hint already. But actually, the trick comes when you actually order the task by the relative difficulties. You can see when you have relatively simple tasks in the field of mathematics, that's what you see here, memorization is okay, at least neutral. But as the tasks become more complex and you need more reasoning, modeling skills to actually solve mathematical problems, memorization is not only not neutral, but it actually hinders students from finding correct answers. They try to remember what was the correct answer and they cannot solve the problem. Memorization can actually work against you. And why is this chart important? Because the world is moving from left to right. Now, this is basically what digitalization is doing to us. It's taking away those tasks that you can solve with routine cognitive skills. There's another strategy, and actually you can see, and this is very important. Many external observers still think, Hong Kong is focusing very much on drill and routine cognitive skills. It is not true. Your teaching has really advanced to this. Memorization in Hong Kong is not very prevalent. I think it's a great point of your education system that it has advanced from that. There's another thing that is very important. That's basically students being able to manage the learning process. We call it control strategies. Setting goals, monitoring progress, basically relating to knowledge. And you can see that's a good predictor for student success. More so for similar tasks, for very complex tasks, that's not so sort of easy. No. Control strategies are very important. And it's a great strength of Hong Kong. Hong Kong is one of the top performers in building active learning strategies among students. As teachers, you do that really well here. But, if you want to get to the hardest part of the task, you need something else. These are the elaboration strategies. This is giving students a space to try out things, to connect things they don't know with what they know, and so on. That's really the best predictor for good performance at the top end of the distribution. And remember, in PISA, that's perhaps the small weakness of Hong Kong. Compared with, Shanghai and China, students are better at the most difficult, most complex tasks where the world is moving. And that has to do with elaboration strategies. And you can see that's where teaching still can advance. Control strategies are very strong. Memorization has been de-emphasized. But, building those kinds of elaboration strategies is still a challenge for a system like that in Hong Kong. And again, I compare that with Shanghai and China. That's the one differentiator between the two systems. On many things, teaching looks very similar, according to our data. But that is the biggest difference between those kinds of two systems. Test anxiety, you remember life satisfaction was negatively predicted by test anxiety. And you can see that's still quite high in Hong Kong. Now, many students are worried for tests, even if they're well prepared. And you can say, well, for a demanding system, that's the price you'll have to pay. But you have other systems, again, Switzerland, Netherlands, Estonia, and so on, Finland, where you can see actually students still are not so worried for the test, and the system is quite good as well. So something to address, and one of the things that we actually see is that what actually relates to this test anxiety is not the frequency of tests. In fact, I can tell you this. There is no relationship between the frequency of testing and the stakes of testing and test anxiety across countries. The relationship, the negative relationship, comes purely from the perception that, testing is about proving that you're better than your neighbor. That's where actually tests have this kind of negative kind of impact. Where tests are formative, helping students understand where they are, we don't see greater test anxiety, and so on. So it's not the frequency of testing, not the prevalence, not the way in which testing works, but it's usually the kind of motivation that students feel to be behind this. And you can see countries are more or less on a straight line, and Hong Kong is pretty much on the high end of this. And you can look to Finland, to Switzerland, Estonia as systems that do well, have low levels of test anxiety, but also students feel where tests are used, they are more or less, students perceive that's going to help me learn better. Teachers perceive that's going to help me teach better. And schools perceive that's going to help me become more effective. So I think that's a really important part. Teacher support is also very important. I mentioned this already, where basically students say that the teacher adapts the lesson to my class's needs and knowledge. Teacher provides me with help when I need it. You can see anxiety is a lot lower. Where students feel that the teacher graded me harder than they should have, so the perception of lack of fairness, or, the teacher gave me the impression that they think I'm less smart than I really am, so basically teacher not really understand me, that's what's driving test anxiety. So it's not about lowering the demands of tests or making tests easier. It's much more to do with the level of perceived support that students feel in the classroom from their teacher. That's what's driving those kinds of variables. Last but not least, the past was divided. The future needs to be much more integrated, helping students to learn across the boundaries of subject matter disciplines, integrate technology and practice, understanding that learning is not a place. We don't bring children just to school. Learning is an activity that extends through everything that we do in school. And that's obviously, where technology is a very powerful driver. Why should students learn from a textbook that was printed 2 years ago and maybe designed 5 years ago, when they can actually access the world's most advanced knowledge through technology? Inquiry-based pedagogies. Every student can now participate in laboratory experiments rather than learning science in the abstract through technology. There are amazing kind of solutions available for that. Collaborative platforms, feedback, making it granular, integrating the worlds of assessment and learning, making it one rather than seeing testing, taking time away from learning. That's the promise of technology. But I also want to show you the reality today. It looks very different. Here you see the technology intensity in the classroom. Green is more, red is less. This is the OECD average. And on the vertical axis, you see the quality of learning outcomes. And I'll show you something where you would expect technology to have most of an impact: digital literacy. And what these data show is actually a little bit of technology can help improve outcomes, but most countries are well beyond the point where technology has a positive impact. In fact, if we're honest, today, technology does more damage than good in learning outcomes. Why is this? We don't have a good answer to this. We have, on the one hand, 21st century technology around us, everywhere. But we still only have, 20th century pedagogy, in a way, a 19th century kind of school organization. And that kind of combination is not working well. If students, use a computer to copy and paste things from Google in the classroom, you surely get worse outcomes than with very traditional kind of teaching and learning. So it's not a matter of putting more technology in the classroom. It's really about enhancing the pedagogies, using technology more productively. And actually, one of the things that we see where we use teachers to where we use technology to connect teachers, to build platforms for co-creation, for knowledge sharing, this is where technology can have a very powerful impact. But in the classroom, we still need to become better in developing pedagogies before technology can be expected to do better for this. How do we move from, standardization and conformity to actually ingenuity? Capitalizing on the good ideas of teachers. This is a chart which sort of, for me, was the most kind of, almost depressing kind of finding from our survey. We asked teachers, if I'm more innovative in my teaching, am I going to be recognized, rewarded for this? And you can see it's only a quarter of teachers who think that school actually encourages innovation. 3/4 of teachers perceive themselves to be working in an innovation-hostile environment across, the industrialized world. That's not good. We need to give teachers more of a sense of ownership, more possibilities to become innovators and game changers to actually change the education systems. And of course, also, moving from a system where lots of policies and practices are misaligned to better alignment on this. We have, thought about this in the future, and I'm going to conclude with a brief outlook on what we at the OECD have found to be really important for the next years to come. In terms of the resources for learning, technology being one of them. In terms of seeing learners differently. Today, we used to learn to do the work in life. Today, learning is the work in life. How do we prepare students that are, committed and engaged in lifelong learning? What is the role of educators? Shifting from knowledge transmission, which technology will take over one day, towards becoming a good mentor, a good facilitator, a good evaluator, a good designer of innovative learning environments. And of course, the question of what students should learn to be successful in tomorrow's world. On the question of the what, knowledge is always going to be important, and that includes disciplinary knowledge. But epistemic understanding will become more important. It's less about, what I know, science. It's more about, can I think like a scientist? Can I think like a philosopher? Can I think like an historian? Can I think like a mathematician? And can I look at complex problems through multiple disciplinary lenses? That's going to be rising in importance. But knowledge is just a starting point. The skills dimension is equally important. The modern world no longer rewards you just for what you know. Google and Weibo know everything. The modern world rewards you for what you can do with what you know. Applying your knowledge. And that has to do with cognitive skills, but it's also very importantly to do with social and emotional skills. Curiosity, courage, leadership, empathy. Those dimensions have become very, very important for success in the modern life. And I want to add one more thing, and that's attitudes and values. That's perhaps the most kind of controversial debate across countries. There are some countries, United States say that's not the business of schools. We take a very different view to this. In this complex world, it's actually harder and harder for students to find their right place in the world, to see where they are. And where we don't build floors under people, they're going to end up building walls around them. That's the one thing that you can see across the world these days. So giving people values, orientation, learning, teaching not only something, but giving young people a reliable compass and the navigation tools to find their own way is going to be increasingly important. And I know many teachers say, well, don't, load that on my shoulders. This is not something schools can do. And I would say, well, if there is one thing that schools need to achieve, is probably that. And that is what competency is about. Competency is not about your knowledge. It's about your capacity to mobilize your cognitive, social, and emotional resources to do something, to build action. There's 3 classes of competencies that we have put at the foreground to create agency among students. The first is, and that's not going to surprise you, is our capacity to think imaginatively. That's probably the biggest competitive advantage that we have over technology these days, that we can develop ideas that have intrinsic positive worth, create something really new. The second part is about, managing tensions and dilemmas. In a world where it's harder to find out what's good and bad, what's right and wrong, how do we actually enable students to navigate conflicting realities? And then, bringing that to a peer interaction. Now you ask, what implications does it have for schools and teachers? There are actually several things. Let me just highlight 3. The first is our capacity to be open for novelty. Now you say, well, that's a matter of course. It's actually not. It's one of the hardest challenges these days. We're very good in teaching young people our truth, our knowledge, convey what we know. But do we enable them to question the established wisdom of our times? To be open to the novelty, to think around the next corner. That's where success is going to come from tomorrow. Anticipation, reflection, our capacity to step back, to see the bigger picture, to see the forest among the trees. Very important these days. And again, it's not something that you can take for granted. And then finally, translating that reflective practice into action. So let me wrap up with some lessons that we have learned about teaching and professionalism. Has to do with rigor, high level of cognitive demand. That's very, very important. Students perceiving that teachers believe in them and that teachers believe that every student can succeed and learn. Has to do with focus, teaching fewer things at greater depths, rather than making our curricula a mile wide and an inch deep. And I'm saying this because it's one of the most difficult things to do. Everybody knows how to add something to the curriculum. Nobody knows how to take something away. The moment you take something away, it becomes really controversial. As parents, we get very nervous when our children learn things that we didn't learn ourselves. And we get even more nervous when children no longer learn things that we thought were so terribly important for us. But focus, teaching fewer things at greater depths, is one of the recipes of success. And coherence. Why do I say coherence? Because much of our learning in school is still, very much based on how we always did things. We don't actually are sufficiently advanced on learning science. I'll give you an example. We know that the only way you will never succeed to learn a foreign language is to have, in secondary school, someone teaching you a lesson on Monday and one lesson on Thursday. And the brain doesn't develop linguistic skills in this way. This is very much proven today. You would do much better to have, your sports teacher in primary school teaching you in another language, or even better in early childhood education. Those kinds of knowledge you need to still translate into education. Building systems that are more intrinsically coherent, more aligned to how students learn. How can we remain true to the disciplines while at the same time encourage interdisciplinary learning? How can we focus on the things that have the highest transfer value? How can we build learning environments that are thematic, that are problem-based, that are project-based, that put the concept of co-creation at the center, where both students and teachers are learners? And last but not least, how do we remember that some things are caught, not taught, particularly when it comes to the development of social and emotional skills? You don't teach them directly. Students learn them through observations, through the learning environments in which they are. It's a difficult agenda. The future is going to be in education much harder than the present. But I think we have some very good angles to get there. And once again, my admiration to the education system in Hong Kong. I think many countries around the world have learned from your experience and your success. Thank you very much.